neXt Curve.
Hi, everyone. This is Leonard Lee, Managing Director and founder of neXt Curve, and welcome to this episode of reThink, our periodic podcast where we discuss the critical topics that are shaping our digital future with some of the top thought leaders and influencers in the industry. And today, I have the pleasure of welcoming back Prakash Sangam of Tantra, Analyst. And it's great to have him with me today to discuss the latest release of 3GPP's 5G specification. So, Prakash, welcome. It's good to have you again.
Thank you, Leonard. Glad to be back.
Why don't we do this? Let's start our discussion on what the 3GPP is and what a release is. And it seems to be fairly misunderstood as a topic, right? Given that the likes of Qualcomm find it necessary to explain this to even the analyst community, right? And so I know you are a member of 3GPP and are quite familiar with the organization, its functions and its processes for coming up with the specifications. So why don't you share some of your thoughts? And, I just want to add that you've also written quite extensively on this topic as well. So I think you're probably the perfect person to be talking about this and sharing your thoughts. So
it's the process itself is a little bit convoluted and a lot of bits and pieces to it. So it's not that very easy for people to understand it. So I actually have written, as you mentioned, a full series of articles on how things work in 3GPP. We could include that in the show notes or something like that.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
So 3GPP stands for Third Generation Partnership Project, and it started during 3G time when 3G was being developed, and that continued, and it's doing 5G work. So that sounds interesting, right? So
yeah,
it's basic. Yeah,
they need to update the name, right, of the organization to 5GPP.
and what you do when you get 6G, right? So I think that's basically
6GPP.
That's what basically kept them, made them keep the name. So 3GPP is basically collection of specification groups across the world. So there are, groups representing different geographical regions, be it Americas, Europe, Asia, and other places, right? So it's collection of representative from these groups. Mm-hmm. And those regional groups have members as well, which are basically the companies in those regions. So the representative group for US is called ATIS, and all of the companies in the US are members of ATIS or ATIS as it's called. And through that membership, they go to 3GPP and participate in coming up with specifications and such. So 3G as a group comes up with specifications, and these specifications are published in what are called as releases. So you mentioned release 16, that is the latest release that they published.
Yeah.
And then interestingly, 3GPP doesn't decide what is a G, what is 2G, 3G, 4G, or 5G. They don't decide. They only come up with releases. And it is the ITU, International Telecom Union, which is part of United Nations, that comes up with minimum requirements of what G can be called. So any technology that can satisfy those requirements can be called that G. For example, for 4G, it was IMT Advanced. For 5G, it was IMT 2020, and so on. So, and 3GPP comes up with these specifications and technologies, and any release has that technology which can meet or exceed those requirements that ITU has put in, can then be called as 5G. For example, 5G NR specifications that 3GPP came up with in release 15 can satisfy this IMT 2020 requirements, so it can be called as 5G, right?
Right.
Similarly, it was for 4G, 3G, and so on.
Wow, who would have known that it was so complicated? And over time, it's really had a pivotal role in kind of bringing together a global standard around mobile wireless technologies, right? Because,
Absolutely. So
back
yeah.
in when we had 3G, there was quite a bit of fragmentation in the market, a lot of different technologies that were competing with each other. And so when you think about 5G, one of the key themes is really global unification of the standards, so that we're all kind of, as a global tribe, if you will, kind of marching to the same beat and drum.
Absolutely. And you look at 3G, there are 5 different technologies which basically met these requirements and were given this 3G moniker. Mm-hmm. When it came to 4G, it is primarily LTE. There was a TDD version of it that also got it, but did not, TDD, LTE, it was all part of the same LTE, so to speak. And 5G NR is one of the technologies that got the 5G designation. And LTE Advanced to some extent might get later as well if it meets those requirements and so on. So, so the whole idea of 3GPP is it's a global organization represented from companies, institutions across the globe are coming together, and it is a very collaborative and consensus-based decision-making process. So basically, whatever they decide, it is based on voting and consensus based. If there is no consensus, it's very hard to move forward. So people are forced to come to an agreement to keep the ball rolling, right, if you will, and come and decide what are the technologies they agree upon to go into standards and to go into specifications and such. So
and I think that's an important point for the audience to understand, especially those who are not familiar with 5G as a technology, especially in light of a lot of the geopolitical attention that 5G has been getting lately, right? I think it's important for folks to understand, well, what was the charter of all of these different releases as well as generations since 3G. And I think we're entering in a really interesting time, especially with a lot of the growing tensions between the United States and China, and these actions against Huawei specifically as a quote-unquote 5G leader, and how it could have sort of an interesting, let's call it an interesting dynamic on how 5G progresses from this point forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, when it comes to standards and specifications, I know, as with any standards, the advantage is you have common technology base on which various vendors develop interoperating products. So when you basically whip out your 5G or whatever G phone in any network, when you turn on, you want to be assured that the phone connects to the network and network connects to the phone. You are able to do the conversation or data exchange or whatever. That is only possible if you have interworking systems built on common technology base. So in terms of leadership, there are many ways to skin that leadership cat. It could be on market leadership, on who has more number of products as such, who has better penetration, who has more technology and other stuff. I think that's much bigger discussion than just the standards. But leadership is a loaded question, and there are many aspects to look at in deciding who is leader and who is not, or whatever. So
and we're going to have that discussion at some other point, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We have to. It's just
absolutely,
yeah. Okay, so we had release 15, right, which was really the first 5G release, and well, some will argue sort of a pseudo 5G release, but let's talk about it for a moment, and then let's talk about how release 16 kind of fits in the picture as far as the ongoing evolution of 5G. Because I think, a lot of people say 5G is here today. That doesn't mean that all of the aspirational talking points around 5G are here today. What people need to understand is that these generational evolutions are in fact evolutions, right? The benefits or the aspirational benefits are not necessarily here today. We have all these companies that are working very hard on taking these specifications and then now applying them and developing technologies as well as applications on top of them. So, you seem to be the right guy to talk about this, since you've written an article recently in RCR Wireless entitled I think it's called 3GPP Release 16 dash stage set for the next phase of 5G, but who's leading? So let's talk about 15 really quickly. I mean, what was 15 to you? What did it mean to you?
Yeah, sure. So as I said, 3GPP publishes these specifications in releases. So these generations are picked on the releases. So like, for example, if you take release 8, had all the specifications that would meet the requirements for 4G. So 4G started from release 8, and consequently there is a release every year typically. And you had up to release 14, it was all, some people call it 4G plus, or 3GPP itself called it as LTE Advanced, LTE Advanced Pro, and such many names which confuse people. But you had 4G and you had 5G. There are multiple releases in between, so at a high level. Yeah. So release 15 was the first time where 5G NR was introduced, which basically met all the specifications, the requirements needed for 5G moniker. It did that. But 5G itself is quite vast. So 15 was its first incarnation of the standard. And obviously it will be, developed, evolved, just like 4G between release 8 and 14. And it actually, even release 15 and 16 will have components of LTE, so to speak.
Right. Yeah.
So 5G starts off with release 15, which is first incarnation, and then you keep refining the specifications, also bring in new features, as you said, the full glory of 5G in multiple phases. So release 15 was kind of a milestone to get started with 5G, and the primary focus there was on enhanced mobile broadband, which is basically to, bring all this famed multi-gigabit speeds, huge amount of capacity, low latency and such, which is only one part of the overall 3G promise, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and the others being URLC, and the other is MMTC, right? Massive machine type communications. And I think one of the, also to me, the purpose of release 15 was really to address what we call at neXt Curve sort of the transitional soup, because as you move from 4G to 5G, and we're talking about from an operator's perspective, there's this transition that you need to make from different technology sets, right? And so one of the features that I think you've already hinted at it is non-standalone 5G core, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Right. The core network and technology really being still, based on evolved packet core versus now in release 16. Now, I think we can transition to what release 16 means, but that's a big feature of release 16 is the standalone, right?
You could actually, even with release 15, standalone came with release 15 again, but enhanced in release 16. So you could actually deploy standalone with release 15 as well. But release standalone and non-standalone, not from, you need specifications. It is more from a market dynamics and timing perspective.
Right.
So you're deploying a new network, you'll have very limited coverage, as you would imagine. If it is totally standard, if you can depend on the existing 4G network you have, it makes it that much easier for operators to deploy, from a time and the investment perspective. So, standalone. So let me put it this way. Since the first phase of 5G was primarily this enhanced mobile broadband, standalone doesn't really bring anything new that the existing NSA would non-standalone bring you from that perspective.
Right.
SA becomes important and becomes essential when you go to this low latency, very extremely low latency URLLC, EURLLC, actually enhanced ultra low latency applications and such. Then you need this standalone, which has a very flat core network architecture, which can provide you that low latency, which you cannot with NSA or non-standalone.
Right. Okay, so I guess we're on release 16 now, but before we get on release 16, I just wanted to make the point that you are making the distinction between the specifications and the technology and the applications that are developed by vendors, and sometimes vendors jump the gun a little bit. And one of the things I found really interesting last year were how many vendors would kind of quote unquote maybe opine that one vendor's core offering was not necessarily 3GPP compliant. So it's kind of interesting to see how the alignment with the standards becomes sort of a talking point in early on before a new release or a new feature is brought actually announced by 3GPP.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as I said, the very core of standardization is to have interoperability.
Yeah.
Right. If that is missing, then you basically are operators are putting themselves in a walled environment where you're logged in to buy other components of the system from the same vendor. So some might do that choice knowingly that they are going with that vendor and in the future as well.
Right.
But typically, if it is non-standard implementation, then it may or may not work with other vendors' components in the same system, right? So,
right.
The best option always is to go with standardized products. But for some people who want to get ahead and deploy even before it's standardized, then they may have to go with non-standard. But ultimately, through a software or firmware upgrade, they have to bring it to a standard. Otherwise, it's very hard to manage, expensive, and resource intensive to manage on a long run.
Yeah, and I think that's one of so now getting into release 16 and standalone, I think that's one of the big things that we're starting to see with the specifications is really driving sort of the software defined aspect, right? With standalone, what now kind of becomes a possibility is this much talked about network slicing feature, right, or capability, and so so I'll lead off with that. But why don't you give our audience an impression of what release 16 means to you vis-a-vis 15, and then sort of how does it fit in the overall continuum of 5G's evolution?
Absolutely. So there are two. I would divide the release 16 into two parts, right? The first one is basically improving what release 15 did. So that's always it was enhanced mobile broadband. You could improve what release 15 came up with in terms of performance, latency, and everything. Like MIMO, better MIMO, better beamforming, better beam steering, and all those things. Right. That is one part. And the second part is new features like IAD is one I mentioned. The IAD stands for Integrated Access Backhaul. So especially when people doing millimeter wave, if you look at it, for millimeter wave to be effective, you need a cluster of hyperdense deployment of millimeter wave sites, right? If you have one site here, one site there, it's not going to cut it. The coverage issues, and I'm sure a lot of people have tested the initial system, said, hey, the millimeter wave doesn't work and such. So for good millimeter wave coverage, you need cluster of densely deployed sites. Then the problem becomes, how do you? The biggest challenge is where to put them. And you might have seen some of the deployments. The favorite place to put them is on the lampposts in dense urban parts of the network. And you put there. Then the biggest challenge after that is how to bring backhaul to them. All of these need fiber backhauls, for example, because they're high bandwidth sites. and bringing backhaul there is extremely expensive as well as very time consuming, because these are in dense urban parts. There are only limited hours where you can work and such. So IAB is basically it's bringing wireless backhaul. You have the same unit that does the user traffic on one side, as well as connects to the core network through wireless link. So you don't need a fiber cable running in. That's one of the key features of release 16 that was introduced, and it will be further enhanced in release 17 and onwards. And V2X, which was again introduced in release 15 on LTE, but being brought to 5G with release 16, which is much more enhanced and improved, and many others we can talk about in detail. One thing I want to highlight: a lot of times what happens is when the feature is first introduced, it may not have full-fledged of features in the standard. So you introduce something, but it basically really be useful and in all its glory in the next release or the next version. A lot of things that are in release 15 or in 5G were actually introduced in 4G in release 14 and before, but they became really fully functional and better optimized with release 15. Same with a few things like this, like CV2X I mentioned is one example, which was introduced in LTE. There are trials going on and such, but with 5G it becomes much more full featured with low latency and such. For example, there are many examples like that.
Yeah, I agree with you. The IAB feature is really important. A lot of the way that I kind of look at it, it's almost like a mesh networking, right?
Absolutely, yeah. That's one way to look at it. Instead of just having one-to-one all connected through cable, you have mesh networking, which, as I said, saves cost, energy, and then also reliability, right? Even if one link breaks, you can have alternate links. So in the right now, the standard is not so much on mesh, but it will be in the future. Right now, it is looked at like a traditional deployment. But it has full potential to be a mesh-like in the future.
Right. Yeah.
And another important aspect of release 16 is NRU, NR unlicensed.
Right. Yeah.
New radio unlicensed. So same thing. It is not, although it is new in 5G, but the concept is not new. It was introduced in LTE with LAA or LTU. Again, perfected. In LTE, it was an afterthought. You had regular licensed LTE and 4G developed multiple releases, and in one release, the unlicensed part was introduced as an addendum. But in 5G, it is by default, it is innate to the standard itself. It is not just a outgrowth or an extension. And going forward in release 17 and beyond, the idea that CGPP has now is unlicensed will not be considered as a addendum, but part and parcel of whatever they are doing. Anything that they will develop will also be applicable to unlicensed, wherever sometimes it may not be applicable, but by default, they're looking at both spectrum as single unit and work towards that.
Probably a topic that we need to talk about also in a separate webinar, because that whole unlicensed phenomenon is quite interesting, right? But one of the things that I thought was interesting, and you cited in your article is TSN, time sensitive networking, and it's something that we wrote about as well in our article, 5G Smart Factory. And you mentioned MComp and these new deployment technologies that are coming out to not only support deterministic networks, wireless networks for, let's say, industrial environments, but also bringing that time sensitivity that's critical for a lot of these process control type functions that you would see in a lot of industrial scenarios.
Absolutely. So remember, you were talking about moving away from this first phase of 5G with enhanced mobile broadband towards massive IoT and mission critical services, which is primarily for factories and industrial IoT and other things. And TSN is one of the key features that makes that Industry 4.0 possible, right?
Right.
So it's basically with TSN you are able to replace almost every cabling, Ethernet cabling that is there in the factory with a wireless link.
Right.
What does that add? It basically use full flexibility for the factories. They can be very modular and adapt to changes. For example, factories now, with COVID happening, a lot of factories are moving to manufacturing the PPE equipment, right? And that takes GM with this order coming in from the government to supply this critical PPE supplies. They had to rejig their whole factory setup itself, which took like a couple of months. But if you had a very flexible Industry 4.0 factory, for example, then it would be a matter of hours or days rather than months, because you don't have to rerun cables or anything like that. You basically they're so modular you can rearrange them. That is very critical feature that enables that kind of setup and features. So basically, totally cable-free factories.
Right. Great. Yeah. And so on that note, I think one of the things that I think needs to really become a focus, and I don't know that, I don't see that it has been, I think there's a lot of talk about it, it's security, right? Because one thing to have a wireline or wired smart factory, you can have a wired smart factory. Wireless is not a requisite, but it does bring sort of that flexibility and modularity that you're talking to the shop about to the shop floor. But security is really important, right? Because now if the connections are wireless, there needs to be enhanced security capabilities that get brought into the specifications. And so it's one of the things that I think is going to be interesting to see how the specifications then start to evolve in that direction of really starting to address some of the security concerns that a lot of the IIoT scenarios present.
Absolutely. So, I mean, no matter what, right? Whether it's broadband for people, for smartphones, or anything else, security is paramount, and it should be part and parcel of it. It's not like a feature. It's basically has to be innate into any systems that we design. I mean, a cellular connection as such has been very secure. It's very hard to get in, and since it's using licensed spectrum, you can't, for example, jam it. It's very hard to pierce through and hack into and such. But again, there will be new levels of security needed rather than other than what is there already right now for factory uses. And then one good thing about the millimeter wave spectrum that is being used for 5G is the range of that is very limited. So people look at it as a negative, saying you need a lot of sites and such, which to a large extent for public deployments, large outdoor deployments, it's true. But when it comes to factories, it could be an advantage, so that you are very localizing the signal that you're doing, that you're transmitting, and reducing the exposure to outside the factory, if you will, for example. And then people outside the factory may not be able to get that signal and try to hack and such. So but security is an evolving subject. It's not, you can't say, I've done everything on security and stop, right? You have to keep evolving with it and such.
Right, exactly. And I guess my concern is more with sort of the mid-band implementations that are bringing around, for instance, with CBRS and what Germany's doing and the UK's doing with some mid-band spectrum.
Correct. Yeah, Germany is
available. Right. Making it available unlicensed, and So I think those are the types of things that we we'll probably see. I mean, the industry is going to demand it, so no doubt the specifications and the standards will evolve.
Exactly. And then looking at customers who are industries, for them, I mean, the security and privacy and security of their data is so important. I think that will be front and center of any people who will develop systems for them. And also, if you look at in terms of cloud and edge, That's another reason there is a lot of interest in private networks and on-prem data hosting from a cloud perspective, so that you have edge, very strong edge versus cloud only architecture. So there are a lot of things happening on that space as well. And security is not a single line subject, right? It's not monolithic. It has multiple aspects to it and such. Yeah.
Right. Although, yeah, I just recently got into a bit of a debate with one of my buddies, Rob Tiffany, on this whole cloud thing. I argue that cloud is the idea of cloud is getting extended out into the edge. He's going to kill me for saying this, but we're going to have a debate next week on that. But yeah, you're making a really good point in that but keeping in mind that there's this huge cloud native movement happening, right? And so MEC is probably something else that you and I should talk about. But there's this whole thing about edge clouds, right? So when we look at the implementation of MEC, we're looking at cloudlets, base stations becoming basically little mini cloud data centers or hosting nodes. So that's probably a little bit in the future. So speaking of future, let's do this. Let's talk about what's going to come next. Release 17. What are some of your thoughts? What are your impressions based on some of the work items that have already been approved? What does Release 17 mean on top of Release 16?
So, release, usually when you have big release like 15, 16, the primary focus, also there are new things. You basically your primary objective is to solidify what is defined in 15, right? 17 is kind of a bigger leap, if you will, when you look at the new things that will be coming in. And industrial IoT verticals is a major focus there.
Yeah.
There are still some enhanced mobile broadband EMEB improvements and such, but bigger issue or the bigger emphasis is on the verticals. And there is something called NTN, non-terrestrial network. They're looking at satellite-based IoT, for example, one of them. And then IAB and others, much more enhanced, much more high reliability options. Like when you go into factories, you need 4 or 5 nines of reliability. There are ways of looking at that as well. And overall, taking wireless to the next level, if you will. And primary focus there is on verticals rather than the smartphones or the mobile broadband itself.
4 5 nines? Are you serious? Come on. 6 nines, buddy. 6 nines.
Yeah, 4 nines is, it's basically, I got into argument, where that 9 start? Do you count the first 99, 2 nines as part of the reliability or not, right? That is given. Basically, what is after the dot? What is after the decimal point?
So are you suggesting 7 9?
Yeah, so it's like 4 nines, they call it, but those are after the decimal point, right?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, you need to be clear about that.
Yeah.
Or you're gonna freak out some of our IIoT audience. Some of the CTOs who are going, 4 nines. I don't think we can get away with that. Yeah. Well, for me, one of the things I thought was really interesting is the work order related to RAN slicing, because there's a lot of talk about network slicing. And, this promise of end-to-end, the promise of end-to-end network slicing and some of the benefits that it'll have for a lot of the operators. I think that's a really interesting thing from my perspective, or at least the way I look at it. And, the other thing I thought was interesting is how we're starting to now see with Release 17, some of the more intelligent network functions being incorporated into the specifications, so like these notions of self-organizing networks. So, like what we talked about before with the IAB, now with these more intelligent capabilities, you can start to imagine more of a mesh type networking function as part of the whole IAB feature set, and then maybe even some more intelligence at the RAN and coordination with the core network.
Yeah, so the SON as self-organizing network, it's again, people might not like it, but it's not new. Just like NRU that we mentioned, it's basically was part of LTE Advanced.
Right.
It was introduced, some were implemented, some were not. But those will come back again when you have this mesh kind of deployment. You have to have those kind of techniques to make sure the network works in a well-organized fashion, right? Because you have so many nodes very close to each other, talking to multiple, the same, especially in looking at reliable networks, you have same device talking to multiple of these nodes. In terms of how you manage that connection, you need to have that intelligence that the networks have to manage it efficiently while providing the reliability they need. Then also Release 17 is looking at a couple of things. NR Lite is one thing that is mentioned often, which means typically, be it 4G or 5G, it was designed for very wide bandwidth, high speed communications, right? Enhanced mobile broadband, that's what you call it. But a lot of times, the IoT, when it comes to IoT, industrial IoT applications, they may not need that much of bandwidth all the time, right?
Right.
So then, but supporting this wide bandwidth and all these capabilities requires a lot of resources, makes the device really expensive. If you're looking at IoT and specific applications which may not need this much of bandwidth, instead they might need very cost-effective design and low latency, for example, as you mentioned, network slicing and such. So Release 17 is looking at defining newer device types, which are basically looking at reducing the cost and complication of the device on 5G applicable to these IoT applications like sensors and others. That's another big thing that is Release 17 is looking at.
Okay, well, great. That was awesome. And thank you so much, Prakash, for joining us on this reThink podcast. And I hope to have you on again. We will have you on again, right? There's no question. Come on.
Absolutely. Love to be on it. I mean, you can keep discussing this for eons.
Forever.
But we got to make sure people don't get bored out of it. So I think,
they get bored. They can't get bored. So why don't we do this? Let our audience know how they can reach you and find out more about your research, Tantra Analyst, and the great work you guys do.
Absolutely. Thanks for giving me a plug. So, you can check out a lot of my work on my website, www.tantraanalyst.com, TANTRA analyst.com, and also have a podcast called as Tantra's Mantra, where I discuss, with myself giving my monologue and, having interviews with people like you. I'm sure we'll have you on it sometime soon.
Love it.
And I write for Forbes, and I have my column in RCR Wireless News, where a lot of the discussions that we had today are discussed as well. So there are many ways. If you search for my name, I'm sure you'll get pointers to those.
Yeah. So everyone, connect with him on LinkedIn. He's a really cool dude. Very knowledgeable.
If you want to get latest regarding tech, feel free to connect with me on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm sure you'll not be bored for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I never am. So thanks. And if you'd like to find out more about NeXt Curve and our research and our services, go to www.next-curve.com. Subscribe to our reThink podcast on Apple Podcast. And you can also reach out to me directly. Just drop me a direct message on LinkedIn. Don't be shy. I like connecting with folks, so I won't bite. And again, Prakash, thanks. It's always awesome having you. and look forward to our continued collaboration here, talking about the technologies and the industry trends that are shaping our digital future. And thank all of you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, Leonard. It was great talking to you regarding Release 16 on this podcast.
Totally awesome. Thanks, Prakash.
Bye.
Visit us at www.next-curve.com.